Hey everybody, it's Tommy Canale and welcome back to Before the Lights podcast. The show that tells you how they made their mark. He has a long, high-profile career in politics that includes being a political consultant. He's an essential writer, a sought-after advisor, and strategist. The host and principal narrative voice of the podcast Sinatra Matters that features recordings from Frank Sinatra's body of work. He states, quote, Sinatra was a musical genius, end quote. All the way from Jerusalem, let's welcome in Michael Fenenbock. Mike, and welcome to the show.
Thank you, Tommy. Good to be here. I only wish I was in Las Vegas with you.
It's warm here. What's the weather like in Jerusalem?
It's very hot, and I don't mean the war. I mean it's hot outside.
Okay, same here, same here. Before we talk about Francis Albert Sinatra, you're the son of an NFL star, Chuck Fenenbock, who was a running back of the Detroit Lions. You wrote a book in 1999 about his career, Fireworks Every Time He Touched the Ball. What's it like writing a book about your own father and his NFL career?
Well, it was fun. He was a very great athlete and a very big star in Los Angeles and then in Detroit. So it was fun being the son of somebody who was famous, but it goes away very quickly. The minute he stopped playing, for years people would say, well, he must be related to Chuck. He was very fast and very strong and a little guy, but very tough. And I inherited all of my mother's athletic skill and none of my father's. So, but it was great fun, and I loved him to death. And he had a great career, and he was a terrific coach too.
You and your wife Daphne, I find out, are legends in the world of Spanish language media. How long have you guys been speaking and doing Spanish?
Well, the speaking part I never was any good at, but we sort of had a little niche for many years in American politics, which was understanding that particularly in California and throughout the Southwest, that the political future belonged to the Latino community, and we were ahead of the curve on that, and so we had a lot of fun with it, and I think added some interesting twist to the Latino world of politics.
I came across your Sinatra Matters podcast as a fan of Old Blue Eyes music and was looking to see, was there any podcast out there about his music? And I came across yours. It's beautifully done. My first question for you is, when did your affinity for Francis Albert Sinatra begin?
I was very, very young. I was in my early teens, and at a birthday party, one of those early teen birthday parties for somebody, and somewhere in the background was playing songs for young lovers, a very early Sinatra Capitol Records album. And I simply went over to the record player and stood in front of it forever, went home afterwards, told my mother I needed my allowance early, and rushed out and bought it. My mother once told my wife, she said, when he was a little boy, that's all he would do is he would sit in his room and listen to Frank Sinatra records. And my wife said, he still does.
Nothing has changed.
So it's a lifelong joy, because Sinatra is indeed a joy. Sinatra music is.
Did you ever get to meet him?
I didn't, but I've seen it. I saw him on several occasions. I'll tell you a funny story about seeing him at Ciro's. There used to be a nightclub in Los Angeles called Ciro's. I think it's long since been closed. But it was a very famous nightclub, and he was appearing there. And I managed, as a young man, must have been 19, to get tickets upstairs. And we were sitting upstairs, and there was a woman in front of us who had a pair of binoculars. Or we had a pair of binoculars, and we were looking, we were a long way from the stage. And we were chatting, and a perfectly nice lady. And once he came on, she reached back and grabbed my binoculars out of my hand and wouldn't give them back. That's a Sinatraism. Unusually, that he was actually accompanied by some very, very important musicians at that event, which I've never forgotten. What a great moment it was to see him in person.
Was that the only time you got to see him live?
No, I've seen him like 4 times. But that was the earliest and the one that always sticks the most in my mind.
This might be trying to ask a parent which child is the best, but do you have a favorite song of Frank Sinatra's?
Well, I get asked that a lot. Sinatra's legacy is this extraordinary body of work, this huge number of definitive recordings, most of which are from the Great American Songbook. In other words, from everybody from Cole Porter to Irving Berlin to Jimmy Van Heusen and Johnny Burke and Jimmy Van Heusen and Sammy Cahn, whose songs he sang a lot. But I have an affinity for a number of albums. And Sinatra, of course, created the idea of the concept album. It didn't exist before him. And what he did was just to say, listen, a piece of music that should be listened to in one sitting and that has an emotional connection between every song, and a melodic connection between every song. And that became the concept album. So I could tell you many, many favorite albums. I mentioned one, Songs for Young Lovers, which was a very big breakthrough album, early 1953, 1954 in Capitol. Songs, A Swingin' Affair, another very important album from Sinatra. The second of the swinging albums. He had 4 periods. There is a period from 1939 through 1942 with the Tommy Dorsey Band, and a lot of recordings there. And he learned an awful lot. He learned a lot from Dorsey. It was an interesting relationship that he had with Tommy Dorsey. But from 1942 to the early 1950s, he leaves Dorsey in 42, goes to the Paramount Theater and explodes like nobody's ever seen before. And Columbia Records immediately signs him. He's the biggest thing in American music, not to mention American entertainment. So he is, at this point in 1942, replaced Bing Crosby, which is a tough act, something to do.
Yes.
They're very different singers, though Sinatra was influenced by them. They're very, very different singers. So from 1942 to the early 1950s, he recorded with Columbia Records. And then there was a very contentious breakup with Columbia Records. He hit the skids, to put it mildly. And from the early 1950s, from 1953, he signs with Capitol. And from 1953 through 1961, which is his last recording with Capitol, probably his most important period. But from 1961 on, under his own label, Reprise Records, he again recorded some extraordinary albums. So if you ask me a favorite, I often recommend The concert Sinatra for people who are interested in the reprise period, or uh, 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 Come Dance With Me, which he made with Billy May, which is a very great swinging album, or any of his stuff when he recorded with Count Basie and Neil Hefti, and Count Basie and Quincy Jones. Those are extraordinary events, and you have to mention, if you're talking about Sinatra and the albums, you have to mention his stuff, with his bossa nova stuff, with Antonio, which is just magnificent stuff. So I don't have a favorite song. I probably do, but I think more in terms of the albums.
Understand. I mean, it makes perfect sense. Listeners, I'm going to put a link in the show notes so you can go follow Sinatra Matters podcast, where Michael gives commentary, analysis, and background on each song. When did you start this podcast?
About 4.5 years ago, I started. I just actually wrote a script for the final episode. So I think some 60 plus episodes.
How did you decide which tracks to do then?
Well, I try to do. Listen, he's the greatest ballad singer of his generation. Nobody sings a romantic ballad or could sing of lost love or loneliness and with the same effect that Sinatra did. Honesty, authenticity. His daughter Tina called him the loneliest man she'd ever known, and he just is the real deal. So his ballad singing is just second to none. And his extraordinary technique, particularly as a ballad singer, he learned a technique called legato. And legato is the ability to string seemingly without a breath between two parts of the same stanza, what we call over the bar. He could stretch over the bar seemingly without a breath. If you try and breathe along with him, you will realize what a challenge it is and how extraordinary a technique it is. Plus, there's just nothing like his phrasing. His ability to take he swings. This is it. So not only is he the greatest ballad singer, but he's also the greatest swing singer. By swing, I mean basically he was basically a big band swing singer. Was he a jazz singer? That's a different concept, but he certainly was influenced by jazz and influenced by jazz musicians. Jazz musicians from Lester Young to on down all held him in great regard. But his sense of time, his musical sense of time, Sinatra had a head for tunes, as jazz musicians put it. He didn't sing on the beat. He sang and we're talking about swinging now, when he was swinging. He sang just behind the beat, just a fraction behind it. But it's that hesitation and that anticipation that literally makes you lean forward and is so grabs inside your chest, because he has this ability to do that. He would accentuate a syllable or add a word that does wonders for the melody. I call it the hand. And if you listen to him, he would often lyricists would get mad at him, but he did it for reasons of syncopation. And his dramatic gifts, it's just a perfect understanding of how to bring a song to life, how to bring out the full dramatic potential of a song. And his creativity, if you listen to a song, I'll make a suggestion to you and your listeners. Harold Arlen and Ted Koehler wrote a song called Let's Fall in Love. Sinatra reimagines the song's construction. He sings the bridge as an introduction, followed by two bars of rest, complete silence, followed by an absolute explosion when he sings Let's. It is the most dramatic thing, but he's completely turned the construction of that song on its head. How influential is Sinatra? If there are people in Indonesia singing that song, and they're not singing it off of sheet music, they're doing exactly as Sinatra, but Sinatra completely flipped the construction of the song. So the effect is breathtaking. His phrasing, he had an expressionist way of phrasing. If you go to an album like Nice and Easy, which is a marvelous album, Nelson Riddle, the great Nelson Riddle, and listen to Irving Berlin's How Deep is the Ocean, and listen to the way Sinatra phonetically uses the word deep to make it sound like it's exactly what it says, deep. By the way, you don't need to just do that. It's just a great, great recording of Irving Berlin's great classic. So I don't think you can talk about Sinatra and not talk about the great musicians. When the big band era folded in the 1950s, all these unbelievable jazz musicians who had all played in every band from Count Basie to Stan Kenton all showed up in Hollywood and began work for the studios who were recording. So you have this incredible body of the greatest musicians, jazz musicians in the world, all available, ready to work. And you have Sinatra's unbelievable string of arrangers and orchestrators that are a part and parcel of everything that he did, whether it was Axel Stordahl, who was with him for so many years, the great Nelson Riddle, Felix Slatkin, who was a great influence on him, the violinist Felix Slatkin, Gordon Jenkins, Billy May, Johnny Mandel, Neil Hefti, Quincy Jones, Don Costa. He made one album with one of the greatest string arrangers, Robert Farnham, but it was a curious album. It's called Great Songs from Great Britain, and is often overlooked because his voice had exploded, and his voice was in terrible shape, right. And he could barely get through the album. But he made it with one of the great arrangers, Robert Farnham, and that was why he went to London to make that album. And as awful as his voice was, and it was really broken, it was at the end of his 12-month tour for handicapped children, and which he had gone around the world raising money for handicapped children, and his voice was just exploded. At one point, he was having a terrible time, and he just looked up at the sky and said, "Stop the orchestra." Looked up at the sky and said, "Don't just sit there, come down here and help me." But having said all of that, it's an album I often recommend. As wrecked as his voice was, it somehow had a resonance that, and there are some songs on there like Nightingale Sang in Berkeley Square that are really, really worth the time and attention.
You brought up all those great musicians. How important, and I wanted to ask you this, was pianist Bill Miller to Frank Sinatra?
Very important. Very important. It wasn't just Miller. Miller was central because Miller would set the key, and even before you got to Nelson Riddle, Sinatra would rehearse with Bill Miller, who, for those who don't know, Bill Miller was his longtime personal pianist, but also musical director, though I don't think he ever had the title. He may have had the title. It didn't matter. Sinatra wasn't big on titles. But he was very, very important to Sinatra. Sinatra found him in Las Vegas and said, "Do you want to go to work for me?" And he did, and he worked for him for nearly ever. But it wasn't just Bill Miller. Bill Miller was the centerpiece to Sinatra's rhythm section. And it was a rhythm section that he carried with him in almost every recording. So you have Bill Miller on piano and Celesta, which is that bell-like thing that you hear on Sinatra recordings. That's actually Bill Miller. That's actually played on a keyboard. It's a piano-like keyboard, but it sounds like a bell. And then on bass, the one and only Joe Comfort, who was on every Sinatra session, and on the drum player, well, he had two. He had Alvin Stoller for many, many records, but then he wanted Alvin Stoller to go on the road with him, and Alvin Stoller said, "No, I'm making too much money here in the studios." And so Sinatra got annoyed at that and said, "Hey, I'm Frank Sinatra, and I'm asking you to go on the road with me, and you just said no." So Sinatra pointed to Irv Cotler, who was a marvelous drummer, and Irv Cotler then became his regular drummer. Both of them, both Alvin Stoller and Irv Cotler, are Buddy Rich proteges, although both have a very different approach to drumming, but they're big band drummers at the very, very top of the list. And there's other musicians who are also key to him. Harry Sweets Edison, who comes out of the Basie band and plays a trumpet, a muted trumpet, and used to set off Nelson Riddle had him sitting off to the side and just doing these little beeps. It's just an extraordinary thing. Juan Tizol, who Sinatra stole, according to Duke Ellington, from the Duke Ellington Orchestra, who played valve trombone on many of his great recordings. Milt Barnhart, who people remember because of his great trombone solo on I've Got You Under My Skin. I love Plas Johnson, who is a wonderful tenor saxophonist who you find on a number of Sinatra records. But he had a group of very great musicians who played with him. Not to mention, on the string side, Felix Slatkin. Felix Slatkin was an enormous influence on Sinatra. Slatkin was a very great violinist and was the head of the Hollywood String Quartet. One of the most unusual and often overlooked albums Sinatra ever made was an album called Close to You with the Hollywood String Quartet. So he made an album with a classical music string quartet. It's marvelous stuff. Nelson Riddle does the arrangements, but as Nelson Riddle often said, doing arrangements for a classical string quartet is no easy task. Yeah. But Felix Slatkin was very, very influential in Sinatra's recording career and was always his concertmaster. Concertmaster was the first violinist. And even when he recorded with Gordon Jenkins, he would insist on Felix Slatkin being the concertmaster, which annoyed Gordon Jenkins because Gordon Jenkins had his own ideas about who should be the first violin, but it didn't matter. Also, Felix Slatkin conducted an awful lot of Sinatra sessions because he was both Nelson Riddle and Billy May were terrible conductors, just really mechanically terrible. Sinatra was a better conductor than they were. But so Felix Slatkin often ended up actually conducting.
I want to get into some of his particular songs and talk about them. I picked out a handful of them. The first one is one of my favorite. It was recorded on August 31st in 1939 as a ballad, was a huge hit in 43, spending 21 weeks at number one and sold over 1 million copies in the song All or Nothing at All. This song for me, Michael, I love the opening riff. Nelson Riddle with lyricist Arthur Altman in 1966. There's something about the opening riff of this song that every time I hear it, it just gives me this good feeling. I can't explain it, but this song has an effect on me every time I hear it.
Yeah, me too. Yeah. Well, not to put too fine a point on it, he first recorded All or Nothing at All in 1939, before he was with Dorsey, when he was hired by Harry James, the great trumpeter who became a band leader and a new band leader, having left what's his name, the great clarinetist Benny Goodman. And for those who don't know how great a trumpet player Harry James was, I recommend you listening to some of that Benny Goodman stuff. It's just magnificent. He was a great player. Sinatra is picked up by Harry James. And the first thing he does is he records a song nobody ever heard of called All or Nothing at All. And it went nowhere. Nothing. Zero. Zip. He then is hired by Tommy Dorsey and everybody forgets about it. But in 1942, when he leaves Dorsey and he gets picked up at Columbia Records, the recording industry was having a strike, and nobody could get in the recording studios. So Columbia had this huge hit star, but they couldn't record him. So what they did was they re-released Harry James' version with Sinatra of All or Nothing at All, and it exploded. It became the biggest thing anybody heard. Now you're pointing to what is one of my very favorite recordings, which is Sinatra. The song is actually a ballad, but Sinatra swings it in when was that album? No, in 1960 something.
Because it's on Strangers in the Night in 66.
Yeah, Strangers in the Night. And that's with the great organ. Well, one of the greatest musical breaks that Nelson Riddle ever created, and Nelson Riddle created a lot of them, is in that recording. I love that recording. I think it's a great recording.
It is. The next one I want to talk about is Come Fly With Me. That was composed by Jimmy Van Heusen. It's in the album of the same name in 1958. People, this has appeared in numerous films such as Raging Bull and Vegas Vacation and Catch Me If You Can, just to name a few. Your Fenenbock group did a documentary titled Come Fly With Me as a tribute to Frank Sinatra. What is it about this song that you like so much?
Well, Jimmy Van Heusen was very, very close personal friend with Sinatra, and they had known each other from the early 30s. Van Heusen, first partner, and Johnny Burke wrote Polka Dots and Moonbeams, which was a very early hit for Sinatra. Johnny Burke had a lot of health problems, and finally, although the two of them, Jimmy Van Heusen, not only was Frank Sinatra's personal songwriter, but he was also Bing Crosby's. And so all of those Bing Crosby, Bob Hope movies that were so popular at the time, it was a long time ago, in the 30s and 40s, where all the music was done by Jimmy Van Heusen and Johnny Burke. and then he becomes Sinatra's guy. But Johnny Burke got very sick and eventually passed away. And Sinatra paired Jimmy Van Heusen with Sammy Cahn. And that's where Come Fly With Me, I think, is very early Van Heusen Cahn getting together, and Sinatra literally saying, I need a song for this album. By the way, it's the worst album cover that he ever made, and he hated it. And he said it looks like an advertisement for TWA, which is exactly what it looked like. It's a terrible album cover.
It is true. I have that vinyl, so I know the cover. The next song I want to get into is on his 1961 LP, I Remember Tommy, which was a tribute to Dorsey. The song, I'm Getting Sentimental Over You, which was written by Ned Washington and George Bassman, arranged and conducted by Cy Oliver. It was recorded by Tommy Dorsey first, and then Frank redid it as the tribute to Tommy Dorsey. You talked about ballads. To me, this is one of the better ballads that Frank did.
Gets to me every time. Let's go back to the idea of legato, because that's I'm Getting Sentimental Over You is Tommy Dorsey's theme song. So Dorsey would play that night after night, and Sinatra would sit on the bandstand and look at him and say, how the hell is he doing that? Because Dorsey is playing this trombone and not taking a breath. Everything is this smooth, linky, over-the-bar legato. And if you listen to Dorsey's version of this song, which is Dorsey played it a million times, it is just extraordinary what he can do with the trombone. But Sinatra sat there and said, I can do that vocally. And he learned how to do it from Dorsey. Then when he records I Remember Tommy, which, by the way, didn't always good memories of Tommy. There's a great story about Tommy Dorsey going on television saying, and Sinatra came on, and Tommy said, let's do one for the old time's sake, Frank. And Sinatra said, no, I don't think so, and walked off. But that was Sinatra. That's a very great song, a very great recording, because Sinatra actually is saying with that recording, you know how you taught me how to do that? I can do it better than you can. And it is simply powerful and moving. You're very right to pick that one out. It's a great song. By the way, it's an often overlooked album, but I think it's a terrific album. I Remember Tommy. Lots of great stuff on it.
In Tommy Dorsey's orchestra, was Nelson Riddle in that orchestra?
Yes, but after Sinatra. Riddle leaves the army after World War II and joins the Dorsey orchestra as a trombone player and an orchestrator, but Sinatra had long since left. There's a connection, which is they would love to sit and BS with each other about. Sinatra always liked to talk about Dorsey days, but they were never there together.
1962, his song Goody Goody. It's on his Sinatra and Swing and Brass LP, a 1936 song composed by Matty Melnick and lyricist by Johnny Mercer. This song, it's an up-tempo, it's a quick beat, but I like the lines and the lyrics when he says, so you met someone who'll set you back on your heels, goody goody, and then comes right back with says, I hope you're satisfied because you got yours. I like the song. I love the lyrics of this song.
Yeah, that's him playing with lyrics. He did a lot of Johnny Mercer songs. That's a Neil Hefti arrangement. It's a marvelous album. He made two albums with Hefti. The other one was of course, the Basie album, which is an even better album, if you can say such a thing. Neil Hefti was just a magnificent arranger, a great arranger. I love that song too. He really swings, and he's having a lot of fun with it.
The next one I want to go to is one of the listeners probably are more familiar with than some of these songs we brought up. Hopefully they've heard them all. Strangers in the Night is a popular song. It was his return to number one in the pop LP charts. The single was also number one, and it's a certified platinum album that remains his only solo album to achieve that certification, which is shocking to me with all the great music that Frank Sinatra did. When I hear the title Strangers in the Night, Michael, I would go back to an interview I did with Tom Dreesen, who opened for Sinatra for 14 years. And he told me he told me a story one night that him and Frank were driving around the desert of Palm Springs, just having conversations. Two guys, one from New Jersey, one from Illinois, just talking. And Tommy Dreesen says, I start singing Strangers in the Night. And Frank looks at me and says, Jesus, if you're going to sing it on key. And all of a sudden, here I am in the car with Frank Sinatra, and he starts singing with the top down in this car in the middle of the night, Strangers in the Night. And every time I hear the song, I think of that story that Tommy Dreesen told me. But the song is magnificent itself.
Sinatra hated it.
Oh, he did?
I've never done it for that reason. My wife says, why don't you do Strangers in the Night? I said, no, Sinatra hated it. I don't do songs Sinatra hated. He literally hated it. He thought it was saccharine. He was used to Cole Porter and George Gershwin, and that was not in that category. There were several songs, but he sang it. He sang it because people wanted to hear it. I like it because, again, going back to the legato thing, there's wonderful legato phrasing in it that I think is quite marvelous. But he detested the song. He did not like to do it. But he would occasionally sing it.
Let me end with songs with this one. Send in the Clowns in 1973. The arrangement by Gordon Jenkins, the opening line of this rendition that is on your show that I have heard many times, when he starts the show out or the song out with, isn't it rich? There is something about the way he sings that opening line that grabs you in and leaves you hanging in the balance for what is about to come. To me, that rendition is one of the best Sinatra songs he ever did, is this rendition of Send in the Clowns.
He did a better one. And he didn't think so either. And he did not like the Gordon Jenkins version. And what his thinking was, Jenkins had over-orchestrated it, which Gordon Jenkins, for all of his wonderfulness, could very easily over-orchestrate things. Sinatra loved the story, and he'd seen the show, and that comes from a show. And so he knew there was a particular story. He re-records it with just Bill Miller. And if you've never heard that version...
That's the version I'm talking about there. Version there,
well,
yes.
There you go. There you go, where you're on the money now. Because that version will just tear your guts out.
Yes.
It is. And he's telling a story about someone who lost, who lost at the last moment. Suddenly, the story is that the guy had always been, this is actually a woman's song, the guy had always been in love with her, and he had asked her to marry him numerous times, and she kept saying, no, because she's a famous actress. And suddenly, the tables turn, and she decides she's in love with him, and she says, marry me, and he's moved on, and he says, no, I'm in love with somebody else. And she's devastated. And Sinatra tells that story like nobody else can. And whether you think it's Ava Gardner or whatever you think it might be, it is so gut-wrenching and magnificent. And just he and Bill Miller telling that story. But he didn't like the Gordon Jenkins. It is not that he didn't like it. He just thought it was over orchestrated.
Yeah, it's the Bill Miller version, especially the beginning when he says, "Isn't it rich?" And you just hang. It's like you're waiting. It's there's something about those 3 words when he starts that song.
You got it. You got it.
What is Frank Sinatra's impact on popular culture?
Well, it's a very long answer to that. He changed the way we hear singers. It changed the way we listen to music. You started the show by saying that I call him a musical genius, and he is just that. He's a musical genius. Genius is something that lies on the other side of talent. Talent is here. Genius is beyond that. And genius is very, very rare. His legacy is the recordings. It's just extraordinary, and it doesn't go away. And it's also, if you think about it, he's been well. Look at the great disc jockeys and the great radio personalities, from Jonathan Schwartz to William B. Williams to Sid Mark to Johnny Magnus, to the writers with the great Will Friedwald, Mark Stein, Pete Hamill, Pete Welding, Ralph J. Greason, Adam Gopnik, James Kaplan, all of whom celebrate him. He's as relevant today as he's ever been. And just as Gustav Mahler continued to salute Beethoven, you have the modern artists, from Paul McCartney to you name it, all of whom are emulating in some fashion Sinatra. His impact is just extraordinary, and his impact beyond. We didn't talk about his style. That insouciance, that unbelievable style. If anybody who's ever seen just the clip from Pal Joey of Sinatra singing "Ladies of Tramp," there's just nothing like that style, and that style has become, whether it's his fedora but stylistically he has had an enormous impact.
You have said that he is one of a kind that comes along once every 100 years. Will there ever be another close to him?
No, but there's a lot of people that I like who come from him. One of whom plays, oddly enough, plays Las Vegas all the time, or at least twice a year, who is a Mexican artist, the great Mexican artist, Luis Miguel, who I think is one of the great voices of our time. I'm a big Bobby Darin fan. I like a lot of people. I like Peggy Lee. I like June Christie. I like a lot of singers. Jack Jones, the great Jack Jones. So I think all of those voices, and there are new voices all the time, that are really singing the great songs. If you think about the American Songbook, I don't know that there's arguably the greatest contribution that American culture has ever made is the Great American Songbook. It's music that was created between 1920 and in the 1950s. Oh my word! I mean, has there ever been anything like George Gershwin? Has there ever been? So it's an extraordinary contribution. And Sinatra's right in the middle of that. I'm working on something now with Ella Fitzgerald, who was Sinatra's favorite. He had many favorites, but she was one of them. And Ella sang the songbooks, which are another extraordinary musical contribution. Ella sang all of these songbooks from the great composers. There is a song that he never recorded he recorded it, but he never did a modern version. And Jonathan Schwartz points to this song as being one that he regrets that Sinatra never recorded. And that's All the Things You Are. And I wish, too, that he had recorded All the Things You Are in his prime. He recorded it at Columbia, and it's extraordinary, but he could have done more with it.
His music, I think, will never die because of one reason. The next generation that's always behind us, all of a sudden one day stumbles upon this guy by the name of Frank Sinatra and goes, where has this guy been? Well, Frank Sinatra's always been there, but the younger generations all of a sudden accidentally or however get exposed to him. They dive into his music, and because of that, I don't see his songs or his music ever dying. I think it's just going to continue to go and go to the generations that continue to follow, because everybody always somehow finds Frank Sinatra's music.
Artie Shaw once asked, Artie Shaw, the band leader and clarinetist, once said, why do we think Mozart's any good? And the answer is, because after 200 years, he's still relevant. And we're still listening to Mozart. Sinatra is still relevant. Mm-hmm. And you're right, he's still being discovered. And isn't that a wonderful thing?
It's a great thing. Michael, thank you so much for your time and coming on and talking about Francis Albert Sinatra and his music, and just a very, very small, tiny glimpse of his catalog. Listeners, I'll put links in the show notes to all the songs that we talked about, including Michael's podcast, Sinatra Matters. Please check it out. But thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Tommy.
And listeners, before we go, I want to tell you one thing. I did a podcast docuseries in support of Native American rights and the harsh and unfair treatment that this community gets. I did it along with filmmaker Antonino D'Ambrosio. It's entitled A Heartbeat in a Guitar, Johnny Cash, and the Making of Bitter Tears. Being that we're talking about music, I think you should check that out. I'll put a link to that in the show notes as well. That's going to do it for this episode of Before the Lights. My name is Tommy Canale. And until next time, everybody, a salute, a chin chin.